In blockchain, it's easy to keep adding layers, more features, more complexity, more innovation. But at what point does that start hurting the product? I'm Lianna Adams, and today I'm joined by Sam Elfarra, community spokesperson at the TRON DAO, to talk about how founders can avoid over-engineering and build products that people actually use. Welcome, Sam.
Hello, happy to be here.
Great. I'd love to start with your professional background. I always like to hear about, people's journey, where they started and, to where they are now.
Yeah, for sure. So I originally got into crypto around 2016, 2017, just kind of dabbling into it more on a educational perspective. And then from there, I really got deeper into consulting and project management during the NFT bubble around 2020, 2021, 2022, around that time frame. And then got more into kind of the traditional finance with private equity, focusing on, boutique investments and things of that matter. And then also working a lot during kind of that era, during whatever it might be, Discord moderating, anything that I can do to stay involved with the crypto scene as well. From there, I obviously mass applied to various other blockchains and was lucky enough to land a role at Tron about 4 years ago. And I'm looking to continue to stay and continue to grow with them. It's been an awesome journey. I'm getting more deeper into the payments space as well, garnering more educational resources around that, as well as in finance, which is my typical background. But I think financial services more broadly, specifically also including payments, is a massive, massive industries, especially when you're looking at payments. And I think blockchain technology can really disrupt those industries for a positive reason and a compliant one too. So, yeah, happy to be here. That's a little bit about my professional background and excited to get going with this discussion.
Yeah, let's dive in. What's the most common way founders accidentally over-engineer blockchain product?
I think the most common way they do it is they get in their own way. They try to do everything at once as well, where there's something known as scope creep, where when you're building a platform, you typically see other people, either competitors or other platforms doing something slightly different, and you tend to want to do the same thing. I think it's important for founders, entrepreneurs to have conviction, to be able to have adequate co-founders as well, or even like founding team members who are legitimate as too, who kind of see the vision, and not to get so swindled or so fiddle when it comes to the initial scope of your platform. It's really important to kind of have tunnel vision at times, not too much to where you are out of touch, but a good amount to where you can have enough conviction to build out what you originally sought out to build. So that's like the first and foremost. Again, conviction. Two, not having any scope creep, reducing that as much as you can. And I would say the final thing would be just to ensure that you're having a good time. You're understanding that you're building something that is worthwhile and is actually solving a problem.
Yeah, I really love that because it makes me think about, artists, right? Because an artist can keep on painting or working on their art and, just not releasing, not stopping and saying that it's ready and to, let that go, right? So before building anything on chain, what question should every founder ask themselves first?
What problem am I solving? I think that's the biggest thing. And then the second question that they could ask is this a big enough market for me to spend my time on? And the reason why I mentioned that is you want to make sure that you're building a product that's solving a problem to an effective degree and you're able to find product market fit for yourself. If you're dealing in a market that's extremely, extremely limited, you won't have as much, there won't be as many barriers of entry. But, riches are in the niches or the niches as well. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. So if you find a proper niche, you can probably find an effective problem that may or may not be solved. And even in those industries, they have a good amount of prime for growth. So I think that that's also important. So that's the first question they should ask themselves is, what problem am I solving? And then following up with that is, how exactly am I solving, or is this market big enough for me to find product market fit?
That's really interesting because, with my mentoring with founders, I always ask them why, what is your why? And I suppose, with that, that's, what problem am I solving, right? When you think about the why. How can founders tell the difference between a feature users truly need and one that just sounds technically impressive?
Yeah, so that's a good question because we We tend to hear that a lot in the crypto scene, right? We hear a lot of jargon around projects and what they're building. While that is still needed, especially during times where we're still kind of building on infrastructure while also building on apps, I think it's really important that this goes into not having too much tunnel vision. Because if you have too much tunnel vision, you're going to start to focus in on saying things that may not even be needed in the first place, and you're kind of getting out of touch. So I think that's why it's important to have a structured team that aren't always going to say yes to you, who understand that the vision that you're trying to build, while still being able to navigate the entrepreneurship journey that you're probably going to go through. So I think that's the biggest way to figure out if you're actually developing a feature or if you're just kind of putting words together that make you sound smart or make your product sound innovative. When in reality, it's not really solving anything.
Yeah, I really love that answer. And I was also just wondering, like, is adding more decentralization always better, or can it sometimes make the product worse for users?
It really depends on the product you're solving, or excuse me, the product you're building or the solution that you're providing to the problem you're trying to solve. I can't give you there's no one size fit all or one shoe fit all type of standard for that. It really depends on what it is you're solving. If you're dealing with a platform such as trying to build a decentralized AI LLM, there obviously could be a need for having more decentralized nodes within that. But at the end of the day, people want a product or an app that's actually going to function. Utilizing blockchain systems, typically for payment scenarios or even other DeFi scenarios, can be more beneficial than using more centralized systems. So, because there's more security, it's more reliable, there's less costs. I'm assuming it's more, compliant as well. So I think that's extremely important, is to just understand that there's no one size fit all when it comes to, decentralization for centralization. And also it's not black and white either. You can do a mix of both to ensure that you're finding the most optimal standpoint for your company or your product.
Yeah, in some ways, it kind of brings it back to the why, right? Why are you doing this? And it puts the users in the center, so to speak. What's a good rule for deciding what to build in version one of a blockchain product?
Yeah, so can you repeat that one more time? You're saying version 1 of the blockchain product?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Hmm. I think it's really critical to understand that if you're trying to build using a blockchain system, again, a lot of it is very synergistic with, companies that offer financial services. But it's also important to understand that blockchain infrastructure is just that. It's an infrastructure. It's not a virtual asset service provider, or it's not a service provider of any kind. They mainly focus on just providing the infrastructure that other projects can build. So on and off ramps, neobanks, payment processing companies can utilize blockchain systems to move money faster, more efficiently, more cost effective. So that's like a specific problem that we see in the real using traditional rails or legacy rails, is that moving money can be very expensive and it can be very slow. And it can also still lead to fragmentation. While doing it on blockchain systems, assuming you've figured out the fragmentation issue and you're making things composable, it's typically going to be faster, more cost effective, more reliable than traditional systems, assuming you're obviously doing it compliantly.
Yeah, thanks for that. And are blockchain teams sometimes building for developers instead of the users?
Well, it depends on the product. I mean, if the product is an infrastructure or it's a platform that developers can build on to build other sorts of assets, then yes, they have a need for building it or towards developers. But if they're building a retail platform that's typically supposed to service, their end user, and they're just trying to, make themselves or their company sound sophisticated and smart, it's going to be counterproductive if they're doing it in that manner. Because again, that's the go-to-market plan to make a successful product, is ensuring you can actually find product market fit. But if people aren't understanding what it is you do or the service you're providing or the solution, they're not going to, you know, be acquired effectively. So I think that's really important. And it goes into the earlier question we talked about with, how people are marketing their company. And,
Mhm.
types of features, what's the difference between a feature versus just a bunch of words together or jargon? So that's how I effectively would go about that.
And how often do teams actually involve users in the build? Is just as an additional question to what you were saying.
I think that goes into, the alpha or beta testing of a product. You can first start off if you're building a retail-focused product where your end client is gonna be, retail users. Let's say you're building, I don't know, an Uber-like app. You wanna make sure you're doing some sort of testing, alpha testing or beta testing where you can provide it to friends and family to start, and then you can kind of provide it just to people in your community to see how they interact with the app, how it's benefiting them, finding problems or bugs. And then once you guys have done that enough and you're confident that it works, then you kind of take it a step further.
Great, thanks for that. And so if your product requires users to understand wallets, gas fees, and networks, is that already a product design failure, you think?
It depends. And I hate saying that because, again, I've kind of mentioned that earlier. If the product is more geared towards developers, then there's no issue with marketing it to those developers as, hey, you have to use a wallet, you have to use, spin up your own node, whatever it might be. But if you're dealing with end users that typically don't understand a lot of that jargon, abstraction is extremely important. Being able to have gas abstraction where you don't have to pay gas fees using the native utility token of the network or the gas token, and you just have to use the denominated asset you're sending money in. Or a wallet abstraction where the user doesn't have to already have their own wallet. They can just go on the platform and it kind of spins it up. But then the entrepreneur has to then understand, okay, well, if I'm doing that, what type of regulatory regime do I work under then? Because if you're making the wallets yourselves and custodying user assets, then that focuses you guys on as a different type of service provider. So it's really important entrepreneurs understand the nuances of their architecture. Ideally, you want to make it as abstracted as possible if you're dealing with a certain demographic that is going to benefit from those type of toolings. But if you're dealing with more sophisticated end clients who are more developers, then you have a little bit more leeway on that.
Yeah, that kind of brings us back to what you were saying earlier, that there's no one size fits all approach, right? And, on the flip side, when should a founder decide that blockchain is actually the wrong solution for their product?
I think that has to happen before you, or even during the first phases of building. Not everything needs to be built on a blockchain system. I mean, I'm biased towards blockchain systems, obviously working for a blockchain org,
Hmm.
but or at least contributing to one. I think it's really important to understand what it is, what problem you're solving, and how can blockchain systems outweigh legacy systems in doing so. Because blockchain is just an effective ledger where each block has a composite of transactions put together, and then decentralized nodes or validators all across the globe are helping to validate that those transactions are legitimate. Rather, in legacy rails, when you're dealing in payments, there's the authorization, the settlement and batching, or excuse me, the authorization, the batching or clearing component, and then the settlement phase, and then the finality phase. Those four phases that traditionally happen in legacy rails, can effectively be truncated into less than a minute, if not even sooner. With legacy rails, it's a little bit slower because of, again, the systems in chart are not as sophisticated. And also there are additional things that have to be followed. Because when you do a payment, you have to authorize that the person, the payer, has the funds available. And then the payee is able to accept the funds. And that's where the network rails kind of work together. And then the batching or clearing is when the PSP or the acquiring bank batches or all the funds, batches all the transactions. They effectively act as like that central node or that central validator to make sure that all the transactions are legitimate, kind of in that process. And then they send it over through the network rails again to the issuing bank to then issue the funds, and that's when settlement happens. So that three-step phase of authorization, making sure the user has those funds, clearing, making sure that all those transactions are properly batched together and ready to be sent out to the issuing party. And then the issuing party or issuing bank then actually issues the funds or conducts the settlement. And that entire process takes 2 to 3 days. It seems like it takes, or typically T plus one, T plus two, T plus three, especially if you're dealing with it over the weekend. But it seems like it happens instantaneously because when you're tapping your phone, you're conducting e-checkout, or you're scanning a QR code, that type of three-phase approach, what you're really only seeing from a user perspective is the authorization part, where you're making the payment, and then within half a second, if not sooner, you're seeing the point of sale terminal state approved or declined. And that happens very quickly. But money isn't settled instantaneously, and money isn't cleared instantaneously either. With blockchain systems, it can happen much, much faster, and including the finality component, which means no chargebacks are needed. And that's where I think Tron has been successful, is acting as an alternative system for people to build PayFi applications on, utilizing stablecoins like USDT. And we see a lot of that activity in emerging markets where people are conducting activity using that asset, the authorization, the clearing, the settlement, and then also the finality components are all truncated to being more reliable, secure, and faster. And again, people are creating more products to ensure that there are ways in which you can offer like returns and other types of really cool customizations, like you see in the real world where you want to, or like you see with legacy rails where you want to do a return or a chargeback. But that's beyond the scope of this conversation. I think that's just a very, very specific point of how blockchain systems can disrupt a certain industry and how critically you need to think about where blockchain can live. Otherwise, if you can't find those problems and you're just trying to use blockchain as a way to raise funds, that's kind of a different thing. But yeah. And then also, before I move on to, with agentic commerce and agentic finance, there is a large reasoning and thesis for why they should be using blockchain systems. TRON DAO recently joined the Agentic Artificial Intelligence Foundation, so AAIF. It's associated with the Linux Foundation. We joined as a gold member, and we're very excited to be a part of it to kind of push the age of agentic commerce. We think that AI agents, and I think the broader industry is also kind of moving in this direction where AI agents are going to be doing more activity and transactions than humans, because again, they're automated systems. And if they want to be able to move fast, compliantly, and transparently with a proper trace, using blockchain systems and digital assets are the best way of doing that, because that 3 to 4 step payment process of authorization, clearings, batching, settlement, and finality, it gets truncated. It becomes much more reliable and faster when they're using that. So that's a lot of different things I mentioned, but hopefully that kind of gets to the root of the answer.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love the answer. It's so succinct and also comprehensive, right? And I love that you touched on agentic as well, because I think that is the future. And I feel like, we could unpack that, another day, because that's a whole topic altogether, right? How can founders keep engineers excited about innovation while still protecting simplicity for users?
So if you're talking about engineers within the team's company, I think
Mm.
ensuring that you guys are on the same page of what you're building is important. If you're talking about engineers outside of the company that want to build on a decentralized stack, I think it goes to the same thing. It's making sure or a slightly different thing, making sure you have proper documentation, but also making sure you have proper use cases and identifying case studies. So, for example, what type of use cases can a blockchain system provide? I've talked about how it can provide solutions to the payments industry in a compliant manner. I've also talked about how people can build smart contracts like on and off ramps to offer that type of a solution and then ensuring that everything's compliant. And then case studies would be focusing on the specific projects that are building those types of use cases on your infrastructure. And I think Tron, we've done a phenomenal job of that, from identifying PayFi companies in the merchant acceptance sector or vertical, where they will issue out Visa or MasterCard cards where you can top it up using digital assets on Tron, compliantly speaking, and then also be able to go to any sort of merchant, whether it be on site or online, and be able to actually utilize your digital assets in an effective and compliant manner. And so that's the specific use case, and the case studies would be the projects actually doing that. And I think founders being able to understand that phased approach is critical to gaining more mass adoption of people utilizing your stack, utilizing your product or service that you're offering, or offering it to end users.
Amazing. And before we wrap up, what's one product decision that separates successful blockchain startups from over-engineered ones?
I'm gonna give a very simple answer, and it's may not go to the root of your problem or the question you're asking, but it's have good co-founders or a good founding team. It's really important that you're on the same page with your co-founders and your team members, making sure that you're patient as well with each other, making sure that you guys have complementary skills and not to get too greedy. I think that's extremely important for startups to become successful, is to understand that, because at the end of the day, if you're going into an industry or a sector that where you've identified a problem, and that's one, and two, you've identified that the market is big enough for you guys to enter, and then three, you have then figured out how the team structure works. All it really takes is time and execution, and then making sure that you don't have scope creep, but also you don't have insane tunnel vision where you're out of touch. So that kind of has a full circle effect of what we talked about earlier in this podcast, or in this episode, I should say, where you need to make sure you're solving a problem, and you're not just building a solution and then finding the problem. That's extremely important. Have amazing co-founders or a founding team that where you guys have complementary skills. And then again, being patient, making sure you don't have scope creep, but also don't stay, make sure you're still in touch with what's kind of happening with the market. So I think that's how founders can be successful and how they can ensure they're not over engineering or spending too much time building things that may not be necessary to begin with.
Sam, thanks for helping us break down why simpler often wins in blockchain. And if a product is too complex to use, it's too complex to scale. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the next episode.